This is going to be the fourth time that I've presented on this modeling concept, this modeling thing in this meeting. And it's going to be the last one. I think I've gotten clear enough on this now to get off of this hypothetical stuff or kind of basic rules for research, basic rules for science, for this systems science thing, whatever that is, and just start doing dirty work of collecting data and all that kind of thing. So I'm going to make an argument here, and it's going to be that it's going to be about what is standing in the way between Bowen theory, such as it is, and I mean the theory itself, the scientific part, or the part that ought to be scientific, and science proper. I've been trying to, this has been a hunch that I've been trying to work out, and I've been doing it through a lot of different presentations, not just in this meeting. But I think that there's something that is very specific that is standing in the way, and I'm just going to try to nail it down. So it's going to be the relationship between model and theory. The theory part is pretty strong in this scene, if you will. And I think that the modeling part is not super clear. And I think it's understandable because it's the hardest part, I think. So anyway, let's see how I can do with this. So just straight off the bat. So the thesis that I'm throwing down here that I'm going to unpack is that Bowen theory does not move towards mainstream science without predictive models. Now, that's not entirely right, actually, I don't think. I'm not just going to say that's the whole story. I think that, there might be, I could hypothetically imagine someone who's reading some paper about Bowen theory, and then suddenly somehow in their mind, the view comes into place, just, by the will of the gods. And then all of a sudden, not only human systems in general, but the family in particular starts to look like it has a bit of a functional structure, a behavioral structure, not just a physical structure, like the dominance hierarchy of reproduction, which is the physical structure, more or less. Maybe that'll happen. I don't know. But I think that it's probably reasonable for mainstream researchers to pass this theory by until there are predictive models that form the argument for the theory. And my thesis here is just that it's missing, but I think that I've got to unpack exactly what I mean by model to make that clear. So I'm elevating the term model to a technical term, which means that there is a function that I'm trying to capture here. This might not be the right word for it, but I think any critique on the thesis ought to better articulate the function that I'm getting at, the problem that I'm getting at, rather than the exact terms that are used. Maybe there are better terms. So by technical term, I mean it has a precise definition and a place in the chain of the scientific process. So here's the problem as I see it. I got a few slides here for the problem. You can debate all day about what science is. You can debate all century about what science is, and that's always going on, and that's good, I think. But there's a piece of this that I'm trying to pull out here in particular, that there is a universality to the function of science, the phenomenon of science over the course of the evolutionary history of the species. There is a phenomenon that has called science that has emerged, that is not just a human idea, but it is something that is tied into natural laws itself. The practice of it is tied in. And, there is a certain kind of value that comes that is instantly recognizable when you have a certain kind of knowledge that predicts. And I wrote here, well replicated predictive models are instantly accepted. And I think that that is a particular kind of a criterion that science has uniquely brought to the world, at least the systematic explication of that in practice is a product of science. And so, and I forgot to put another example in here, but you know, I just heard this on the news a couple of years ago. This is the first time this dawned on me. You know, when the average Joe's watching the news and there's a story that there was, and I got this number wrong, this 75% thing about lung cancer. I don't remember what the number is. It's not the point. It's that when somebody watches a news story, just the average Joe watches a news story that says, some 17-year-old kid came up with a way to detect lung cancer with a computer program. And it can do it with this amount of accuracy, and it's pretty high. Like, everyone gets it. You don't have to just kind of, you don't have to go through the long-winded academic critique. I mean, that has to happen in the background. But if you can say that, you know, if you come up to any primitive non-intellectual culture, however you define that, and say that, yeah, the sun comes up every day. Tomorrow it's going to come up and it's going to have something in front of it, and it's going to be dark all day. Even a culture that doesn't have science can get that, and especially if you do it 2 or 3 times. So that's all I'm talking about. There's a basic thing happening here that is universal, and that is deeper than a human idea. That's something, I think there's a reason that neuroscientists today are using prediction as a main principle in theory for behavioral theory, for lack of a better word. So that's kind of like at the academic level, that has a particular value and potency to it that automatically is recognized. But then, you know, so at the academic level, as an example, let's say, you know, you do an experiment, you get it replicated, and you get it replicated 5 more times, and it's replicated by people who really don't want to replicate it in different domains of expertise. That's really strong validity. Well, there's another level to it, I think, which is where the knowledge or the tech or whatever the prediction was, whatever the discovery was, is actually put into practice all over the place in great numbers. And it's so reliable that you forget about it. You don't even have to think about it. It doesn't take calories to run through the knowledge in order to use it. And the example for that is, I mean, I'm talking over Zoom. I've got my phone. It manifests millions of such predictions simultaneously every second, and we don't even care because we don't have to. It's done. So that's another level. That's the ultimate level, I think. So the downside of this, I think, and remember, this section of this first of 3 sections is the problem. So that's an upside. That's an amazing thing to discover, how to systematically move towards that kind of prediction, that universal kind of knowledge. But the downside of that is that while that has some prestige and deserves it, that kind of prediction, just like anything, I think it's easy for it to erode into a dogma, for the prestige to be shoplifted, to use that funny word from Jerry Maguire. It's exploited without the rigor behind it. And so all the terms, the words, like science, like prediction, like fact, like theory, like variable, like data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, carry the value and can be used as in ways that do not pertain to that universal phenomenon, that universal criterion of well-replicated, blind, falsifiable prediction. And this is happening in the academy. I don't know if any of you have seen the I think there were 3, but I know there were at least 2 efforts to hoax various sociological journals, where there was such pseudoscientific jargon used in these kind of isolated, I would call them philosophical areas of academia. They had these journals, and the jargon was so specialized and so esoteric and so incoherent that the hoaxers came along and wrote and just made up experiments using new jargon that fit the pattern of the old jargon but wasn't the same words, and they were accepted and applauded in these scientific journals. You know, so that just shows that the journal has lost its connection with the scientific part of it. And maybe the journal has another function, and that's fine. But there's a prestige that comes with the universal characteristic, the scientific principle. I think it's got to be, of course, the core scientific principle in the natural sciences anyway, prediction. That comes with a particular prestige that is easy to get lost. And it's easy to attach onto that without actually having the rigor behind it. So in the, I don't know what you call it, I'm going to make this mistake throughout these slides, but there's throughout the culture, throughout the tradition, throughout the lexicon of Bowen theory, because that I don't think is the same as the theory. There's how people approach the theory, and then there's the theory itself, and then there's the natural phenomenon that theory is describing, all different things. I think it's easy for words like fact and variable and data to have to be attached to the prestige, but it's easy for it to erode because we're all just doing the best we can, myself included, to stick to the precision. But it's easy to have, for example, a timeline of facts that are not facts, you know, and then you have to get into what's a fact and all that kind of thing. And so anyway, I mean, my whole point being that there's a particular function that is easy to get. If it doesn't have its own term, I think a technical term, then it's easy for it to get lost in the weeds. Then you have no way to point to it. Like theory, and this is all coming from Bowen's Odyssey chapter. I mean, I'm sure you're picking up on that, where you've got a term like theory, and if it becomes opinion, if it becomes equated with opinion, then you have no way to actually describe something that has evidence behind it that is moving closer towards greater validity. And that's frustrating and not very productive. But I think the same thing is probably true for variable and data. In fact, it's, you know, if you use variable for anything that has an influence in a complicated phenomenon like family, then what is the word that you use for something that's actually quantitative? For example, the variable of differentiation of self, the variable of anxiety. What do you have for the factual variable that would be used, or that would be when you have a variable that really is a quantitative variable, even if it's just a binary variable, yes or no, and not a numerical variable, an integral or ratio variable. Anyway, I think factor is a good word for that, but I'm just pointing out the problem, you know. Same thing with data. Data has this kind of feel like it's part of this universal prestige, but what is it when it's really kind of loose and disorganized, or it's only in a pile of handwritten notes? You know, is that data, or is that just information in a heap? So anyway, this is the I'm kind of pointing to this erosion idea as a piece of this broader thesis, as part of this problem that the modeling technical term ought to solve, but I'll get to the actual term in a bit. All right, so this term research, this is in the spirit of the previous slide. This is another one. I think I just got clear on this the other day, and I just put this slide in. It was in conversation with someone else about what is research. And I think it was helpful, or what I got clear on is that my thesis here pertains to formal research. And that is not, this is going to be a weird thing to say, but that's why I have this slide. That is not necessarily the same. It can't be the same as research on one's family, but that's not quite right. So again, that's why I have this slide. That the effort ought to be, I guess, to apply rigorous thinking as much as possible to one's own functioning and how that functioning is modulated in the context of a broader biological system. Yes. However, the product of that research, and you all, if any of you have ever seen a counterexample for this, please tell me so I can stop attempting to differentiate in the way that I am. But I have never seen an effort, an actual product of an individual effort at differentiation of self in the research vein that produced something that was acceptable and peer reviewable in a scientific journal. It had some kind of a generalizable, i.e. moved beyond a case study, even though case studies have their place. I've never seen an individual differentiation effort get there. That doesn't mean the scientific principles aren't being applied and the effort isn't going there, but that those are not necessarily the same thing in terms of outcome, because the standards for formal academic research are extremely high compared to, has this had an impact on my life? And it took me a while to get clear on what I just said, because Bowen, the person, made this amazing contribution. I think it's amazing. It's one of the things that pulls me back to this theory constantly, which is an integrated view to house all this stuff. And I think it's integrated by the research mode, more or less, that you can be a professional, you can have a client, and each one of you are, in effect, you're not doing the same exact thing, but you have this similar organizing principle underlying what you're doing, not only in the case material individually, but in your own functioning at the same time. It's this universal principle, and that's pretty incredible. But I think it's also easy for that research attitude and the outcome of research on one's own family to be the same. It's easy for that to appear the same as formal research. And the only reason I'm going down this road right now is because I think the presence of a well-replicated predictive model is probably a big difference between the two. All right, enough about that. This is actually in the next section. So, all right, so the problem being, to sum up the problem, that I think there's something missing in, I think that that descriptions about refining theory, researching theory, thinking theory, using it to guide professional practice, using it to guide a grow-up effort for oneself, all of that is pretty darn rich already. But the modeling part, it hasn't been defined very clearly. And so that's what I'm going to try to do here. Just the basic scientific principles for this, regardless of what model is built, and how that relates to this unique challenge that Bowen put out there for the social sciences. He was saying psychiatry. I started saying social sciences, but you know, that he raised the bar in some ways on basic scientific criteria. And so that also created this kind of integrated view I was just talking about, but it also has this problem of not having the modeling phase or the prove it phase being clear. So this is what I'm throwing out there as terms. And again, I'm trying to capture a particular function. Each one of these has a function in the scientific endeavor. And so the terms may not be perfectly accurate, but there needs to be terms. As long as I've got the problem right, there needs to be terms. And I like these terms, so here you go. All right, so the model itself, the ultimate goal, the thing that automatically raises eyebrows in the mainstream, I am saying is a predictive model, a well-replicated predictive model. What is that? What exactly do I mean? I mean a device or an extracranial, that's the whole thesis for this thing, that calculates predictions. The actual computation is done by the model. And that occurs with the data. It takes the data as input. The whole point of this is to get it outside of the brain. Someone used the brain, that phrase in his videos, and I think it's great because the calculation can occur in the brain but appear to be objective. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is that the model is something explicit, it's tangible. It's even if it's a set of instructions on paper, the point is to get the person's computational, evaluational function out of the head onto something else, to get it automated. And this is not a complicated concept. And it's almost hilarious that I'm having to say any of this, or even having to clarify it, like I said, I've been doing for 4 years personally, because none of this has to be said in the hard sciences. This is all just taken, nobody even has to think about it because all thinking is on models. There is theory, but it's all, the conversation occurs around models. So what do I mean? It's like an example is just a regression equation. That's a model. The computation occurs outside the brain. You've got weather models. I pull up and I just looked at the weather for a barbecue I'm having tonight. There's an incredible amount of models that are all automated. You don't have anybody doing that mentally. That's for sure. And they're not super great, but they're sure useful, Ian Cousins' fish models, it's always the example I'm bringing. The model itself is the code, not the theory that he described. Not the 3 variables per se. That would be part of the theoretical level until it is embodied in a physical form. Or in any way that's automated that gets it out of the brain. So it's actually in the code. So that's the ultimate goal. And there's a submodel. This just came up, over the past few years, needing a word for it again. Then there's a data model. This is the subtask. The data model defines what is tracked. For statistical regression, it would be whatever was fed into the regression model. You've got an independent and a dependent variable. It's the independent variable. Where does that come from? Well, a data model formalizes how it's tracked. So it's just the columns in the table. I mean, this is such a simple idea. But I think that both of these are missing from Bowen theory, and they are a huge thing that's missing from Bowen theory. Even the data model, which would be the prerequisite for a model. What exactly is it that you have to record to capture what is described in theory? What exactly is it that you have to record that would apply across every case? How do you track triangles? How do you track, and not just track mentally, this is the whole point. How do you systematically record the data required to feed into an automated predictive model to tell you what will happen down the next step? Even in the very next step, if the triangle is in this state and you have only one triangle and you don't have anybody else around and it's really intense, what is the next step that will occur? I mean, how would you even record the steps that had come prior? This part I haven't seen. And this goes back to, as far as I know, this is Newton's tradition. This goes back to, I believe I have observed something. How can I prove it, more or less? Well, you have some way of calculating what will occur in the future based on what has occurred on the past, and you provide instructions to replicate the experiment so that other people can go not only run the model, but can go collect their own data according to your instructions and replicate and then run the model. But how do you do that without the data? And I mean the quantitative data, the hard data. And the family diagram is not sufficient for that. It's a brilliant thumbnail sketch that's very useful. And I think it's actually a prototype for what would become a data model. And that's what my effort in the app is about. But this is a more difficult task. So this is how I've got it. Again, if you can hear what I'm trying to say better than I can even say it, then these words need to be replaced. That's great, but there's a problem I'm trying to solve here. Alrighty. So last year in this meeting, I presented a theoretical concept called the implicit model, regardless of whether that made any sense at all. This, I think, is a good application of the idea. I wasn't clear enough on the thesis here that I'm making here today. Last year, it was still more abstract, and that's why I didn't have an example, but this is a good application of it. So when I was saying the predictive model at its best is outside of the head, that the calculation that is making the prediction is occurring outside your head, that means it has become explicit. While it's still occurring, if the statement is theory predicts X and it's verbal and you're just thinking it and you're mentalizing and visualizing the quote data in order to produce that prediction, and then you just say the prediction, the calculation is implicit. It's happening in the head. By my definition, maybe there's a better definition for this, but this appears to be the state of the art with Bowen theory, is that predictions are implicit. They're using an implicit model. And for what I know of basic research principles, you can actually have predictive implicit models because you can have inter-rater reliability on things that are subjective, and that can be durable. And for example, no one has simulated human vision yet. And we are all able to predictably move with the same visual input through the world, more or less. I mean, I'm a klutz, but so I have error in mind, but there is a agreement that works that doesn't have an explicit model yet, and that's great. But I'm just trying to point out what an implicit model is, because I think it's useful in defining what the state of the art of Bowen theory is. That, yeah, predictions are made. Theory does predict in a manner of speaking, but that's not the same as a model doing the predicting for you, me, someone. So that's inherently less subjective, or at least it doesn't have the universal hook that blind, well-replicated explicit model will have. It doesn't automatically raise eyebrows. It isn't universal. So that would be an implicit model versus an explicit model. Last year, I was using these implicit model and explicit model as a theory of behavior, as a bit of a deeper way to do it, but it's essentially the same idea. Okay, so here's a few terms that are gotchas here. The first one was what really motivated me toward this presentation this year. And then I ended up hanging all these other things on. But theory, back to Bowen's contribution. So he made this key contribution, which is still applicable, I think, that about defining how theory works, how a theory works, not just Bowen theory, not just family systems, but like, what is the term theory? What is the term science? What is hypothesis? What are the problems, kind of like I laid out before, and how it can erode away? That's really rich. I don't have anything to add there. It's beyond my ability, honestly. And attached to that was this phrase, concepts from the human brain, that comes up, that I keep running up against when thinking at the modeling level, as opposed to the theory level, or in conjunction to the theory level. That a theory that, you know, his goal was to come up with words that described what was being observed, that fit the thing that was being observed as much as possible, as opposed to some pre-existing model that, or some idea that was more a function of the brain than what was observed, something like that. Maybe you can do better at explaining what I just said, but that's I think good enough for now. That there is a problem that occurs when there's an idea that isn't grounded in the feedback loop of observation and testing and scientific rigor, defined that way. There's a problem that occurs when an idea is just slapped onto something and called a theory. And the poster child for that, within this culture, tradition, lexicon, whatever, how do you do that without avoiding togetherness? I don't know. How do you say that? But the poster child for that is general systems theory and cybernetics. And by the way, these terms, I think these terms serve a particular function still, but they need to be replaced because they're horribly out of date. And so I'm getting at functions and problems here because maybe there's better words for this stuff. But when I started seriously reading Bowen Theory literature early in grad school, and I started talking about general systems theory, conversation over, everybody stops listening. And it took me like 3 years to figure out why that was, because it seemed to me like there was a particular point attached to these terms. And I think that's actually still true. So there was a fallacy in here, a fallacy from the point of view of the way that that Murray Bowen, the person, decided to proceed with theory. There was a problem with simply taking a mathematical model, in the case of general system theory, and then applying it to a natural phenomenon and calling it a theory, a natural system theory. And Berlinfi and Laszlo, these are two big characters in this general systems scene, use the term natural systems all the time. And that's not the same as the pure inductive effort, which, as I've clarified it anyway, is collect observations, keep them as factual as you can, merely describe the observations in some way that's clear enough that you can merely describe and explain the predictions in some way that's clear enough that you can predict future predictions or observations. Sorry, I got my words mixed up. And just keep to what's observed and try to keep the terms simple. And that there is a problem that arrives in the development of theory when there's all these different terms coming from all these different places. And the first example for that was Freud, taking terms from mythology and that kind of thing, human culture. So great. However, at the modeling phase, it is concepts from the human brain. It is an engineering effort. And I think that this phrase, concepts from the human brain, can end up becoming, it can be functioning as a boogeyman until this modeling phase is actually defined and clarified, because you have to use concepts, you have to use ideas and mathematical theorems and all that kind of thing in models in order to predict. The difference being that in the general systems frame, if you will, I mean, this is generalization, but the difference being that instead of just taking a model and slapping it onto a phenomenon and saying, which is really an analogy and not a theory, and then using that to guide some kind of practice, you're testing the model with blind, falsifiable predictions so that it gets more and more closer to not only the theory, but the phenomenon itself. And if that's the goal, then it doesn't matter what the model is you start with. But if there is no testing, then you run into the theory and therapy problem, which is just where all effort is on therapy, to use the example from, again, Bowen. All effort is on changing without understanding and predicting. And that when you can understand and predict, then how to change it, the options on how to change it automatically open up. And this is evident in all the countless articles and journals on systems thinking and systems philosophy that are not the same thing as this natural systems theory domain per se that Bowen was getting at, because all of those have all of these philosophies. And you can, if you read through case studies and applications of a particular philosophical application of a systems theory, it's really just hammering on the professional organization, for example, and trying to get some kind of an outcome without having a way to predict what's occurring already and what would happen in the future. So here's the example for this. This is the one that actually applies, I think, in the case of the family system, where this problem with this phrase concepts in the human brain comes up. I've said a few times in a few meetings that I think that, and this is, I'm 60, 75% on this only, that the kind of prediction that occurs in an emotional system, whether it's the family or not, would be a Markovian prediction. And let me just give you a little background. This isn't the point. What this is isn't the point. It's the broader principle of theory building and model building. But a Markovian prediction is where you have, given where the state of something is in this present moment, that there is a limited number of pathways forward. That's a Markovian distribution. Like you might say, if I am giving a conversation or giving a presentation on model building, there's a limited number of things I'm going to talk about in my previous slides. Hypothetically, vaguely. I'm not going to go off and start talking about music theory, probably, unless there's an overlap. I'm not going to go off and start talking about some art project. There's a reasonable scope, and that the distribution, the chances that I do choice A, B, C, or D are not the same. So there's a limited number of options moving forward, and there's higher chances than others about which way I'll go. An example from the emotional system, from a family emotional system, would be if I am on the inside of a triangle at present moment, what are my options going forward? And you might correct me on this, but an example scope of options could be, I could, if I'm on the outside, I could try to move on the inside. I could further intensify my outside position. I could differentiate. And maybe, I don't know, maybe there's something I'm not thinking of there, but the point being that there's a limited number of options on what to do next. But the chances, at least hypothetically, that I'll do one over the other are not the same. So there's a distribution of probability and a limited number of options. A Markovian, and that's a Markovian probability. So, as a professional, 10 sessions in, I'm thinking, well, I know a little bit about what's going on here, at least in this nuclear family. And someone says, well, what should I do? Should I confront my wife about this, or whatever the thing is? And yeah, it's correct to say, I don't know what you should do. Like, it's technically accurate, I think, because there is a set of probabilities with a set of there's a set of moves that can be made and a set of outcomes. And you don't know which one. And then each one of those bifurcates off into its own set after you've made that next move. So it gets complicated fast, but just in terms of the next step, you really don't know which one should be taken. However, there is some weighting sometimes to which one is more likely to have some kind of an outcome. It's a fuzzy probability. I think that's a systems prediction. So anyway, I hope that made sense. If it didn't, that's okay. But the point being that this is a mathematical concept. And this might not deserve a place in theory, but it absolutely deserves a place in a model. And so my whole point here just being that I think that there's two levels of conversation. And that's going to take me to this. I think that there's two levels of conversation. Well, maybe five, because I've got five there. But right now I'm talking about the theory level and the modeling level. That those have slightly different boundaries. That the theory level is a verbal thing. It literally has concepts, which literally, by definition, are the brain's best effort at making sense of what's going on in it and around it. It's a psychological concept. I just used it. But that is probably a verbal and literary exercise, effort, project. And that the modeling one is separate. And I'm trying to just differentiate the modeling phase out of here as something distinct. It has its own rules. You have to start getting into engineering ideas in order to produce an explicit model. And here Bowen is coming along and doing and making this phenomenal contribution that theory is often implicit and must become explicit. It was a similar contribution at the theoretical level that I'm trying to poke at for the modeling level. That you go and talk to, if you break down what is behind one of the popular therapies, that the theory is like, well, what's the theory, you know? But there's always something in there that's guiding the therapy, or that's guiding the ballistic missile effort, you know? And if it's implicit, it's just, it can't be tested, it can't be refined. It has to be just formalized and laid out and gone through the process of rigorous critique. So Bowen nailed that one, in my opinion, that theory is often implicit and must become explicit. So my whole thesis is that modeling in Bowen theory is often implicit and must become explicit in the broader formal research sense. And if possible, in the personal effort of differentiation. I mean, who would argue with, good grief, if you can do that, go for it. But I think it's too complicated for that. So anyway, I've got this. So this is how the whole thing fits together, is that this is kind of going back to Bowen's definitions in the Odyssey, you know, that there is the natural phenomenon. You'll never know it perfectly, but you can get closer and closer to it. You make observations of the phenomenon. Hopefully those are factual, because the observations can be subjective, but hopefully those are factual. But that you lose accuracy in each one of these steps as you go down from nature to observation. The observations never quite capture nature because, for one thing, they're low resolution sampling of nature. You know, if you go out there and collect weather data, you've got points in time. Well, you missed all the stuff that happened in between the points. That's one way that you lose precision. But then even from that, once you've got a whole bunch of observations, then in the natural systems inductive mode, as opposed to the deductive general systems route, although there needs to be a new term for that, theory is an effort at describing the observations, explaining the observations in a manner that would also fit future observations. This is all covered in Bowen's writing, let alone everyone that came after him. So similarly, the modeling phase is an attempt to explicate theory. That the model is the closest thing you can get to the theory itself, but it's not going to be quite the same. And this is immediately apparent if you try to build a model of something that is fairly clearly defined. If you try to build a formal model of something that is a conceptual thing, like a theory, the model is always going to be imperfect. Otherwise, it would be called the theory. Same thing with observation, same thing with nature. So then you know, you make interpretations based on the output of the model, and then hopefully there's a feedback loop that goes back and updates the theory. So the updating goes up all the way up to observation, not to nature necessarily. But the precision goes down as you go down the chain. And I'm adding the model step. And again, you know, I think all of this is just like, is so verbose on such a simple idea that it's almost funny that I'm saying it or that I even had to clarify all this stuff. But all of this was driven by particular problems that came up in conversation or what have you. And the reason that I put together this quote chain of command here is for the next slide. It's just to solve a particular problem. So I have a model I'm working on. That's not the point of this presentation, what the model is, but I have a model that I'm working on, and I ran into a lot of these problems. I'm trying to figure out, well, why am I not just using the words that are in theory, and why doesn't that just become the model? Why can't I just sit down and write out a model of the family while I was watching Ian Cousins' presentations on fish? Because it seemed like that would be possible, but then actually when I did it, it was clear that a lot of work had to happen to do that, even to make a speculative model. So this is what I've come up with to solve the problem of how do you build a model? How does theory and model relate when you're building a model? So the goal, as in the chain of command going up, the next step up from model is theory. The goal for the model is to test the theory. The goal for the theory is to test, I guess you could say, observations and so on. But the goal is to test the theory itself. It is guided by the theory. The design of the model, the building of the model is guided by theory, but it can't contain the theory. This is the subtle thing that I probably won't even be able to get across today, but I'm sure of this. The model, if it's going to test the theory, it can't actually contain the theory. And I have an example for this. So it would contain the constituent parts of the theoretical hypothesis necessary to test the hypothesis. So if you want to go out and see if triangles occur, you don't go record every time a triangle occurs. You have to have a criteria for a triangle. What is a triangle? What are the parts that make up the triangle? And then when are those parts not a triangle? That's the main thing that has to be separated out. Otherwise, you're just confirming your hypothesis. And the example model I'm going to throw out there, hopefully within the next 10 minutes so I can stop, is actually a model that asks the question, when do triangles occur? So I'll have a specific example for what I mean by guided by theory but can't contain theory. I think that this is the main thing that can be confused today, is having a model that tests theory that actually assumes theory is fact in the first place and always confirms it. Bowen theory in particular. So anyway, as I was designing this model that I'm about to show, I realized that really it requires, because it is guided by theory. It has to be guided by theory. It's like I'm not studying gravity. I'm studying the family. So I've got a scope that is pointed, that the theory is pointing me in a particular direction. That's fine. But it does require total clarity about the theory. I think that the modeling phase, if it's going to be successful, the more clear on theory a person is, the more successful the modeling phase is, because it is a best guess representation of what's described in theory. So I was trying to come up with a model of how do you track triangles, just triangles, like the simple thing, just track triangles in a universal format of data model. And I spent, I don't know how many years it's been, but definitely during an intense 3-month period, I was going through all these mental loops trying to define what the observables are for a theory in a way that could be fed into a computer. Not as numbers, but just yes, no type of binary states for data. Is this person in this position? Is it that kind of thing? And I had to get really clear about it. And I will now argue that because of that, I don't think that the theory itself has been formally clarified on paper explicitly in this way enough, because when you have that, you automatically have a data model. And I have never seen a data model. So let me jump on to this example. And this is a really poorly, in fact, I'm just going to delete this slide. I don't want to say solution. I'm just going to move to an example for all the things I was just saying about building models. where I am now convinced by trying to do this, I'm convinced that there is enough unclarity for that to be low-hanging fruit for research in Bowen theories, defining what is already in theory in a way that it can be tracked systematically and explicitly outside the head, if you will. So, okay, all right, so here's the question. For this particular model, the goal here isn't to promote the model. The goal here is to use this as an example of how I arrived at the problems I was just talking about. So, great research question. Do triangles occur with sufficient tension? That's something straight at the conceptual level from theory. It's a verbal question. So the data model, as I said, must be guided by theory, but not contain theory. So it has to be falsifiable. That's the difference. So in this case, the question then is, for the data model, what are the parts of the triangle that you would track that would give rise to a triangle under enough tension and would not give rise to triangling and its respective phases with sufficient low levels of tension so that it's falsifiable. And that was the clarity part. I thought, well, wait a second, there isn't really, it's not obvious what to track for that. The theory, but I think that actually, I think that there is agreement about this, but it's implicit and it's kind of an intuitive level agreement. Well, anyway, my best stab at this, and I don't know that this is right because it's just a model. It's not tested yet. I'm getting there. But I had to define what I'm calling the atomic operation of Bowen theory. So now I'm in my model phase. I'm in my model building phase. I had to define something I'm calling the atomic operation of Bowen theory, which is either a toward or away move. There's always one mover and one or more recipients that perceive the move. Potentially, I haven't worked that part out yet, actually. And that these occur over time, these moves, and you can track that sort of thing. A toward is basically increased contact, and in a way is decreased contact. Not totally sold on those definitions, but it's a definition to start with. And then you also track arousal, which is it's my best guess at throwing down an explicit model definition for anxiety. Again, losing precision in the process, but trying to narrow it down so it can be tracked. Well, what about triangles? So if that's all I'm tracking, the definition, so I had to come up with a definition for a triangle. Okay, so if that's always occurring in emotional process, if that's the atomic operation, the indivisible thing that's happening, what is a triangle? Well, I had to come up with a definition for that. So there goes another couple of months of mental gymnastics and talking to people and failing and succeeding. And the definition I came up with, which is not perfect, but it's modelable, is one move that is simultaneously a move toward one and away from another, or more, one or more on either side. A move that is simultaneously toward one and away from another. And I'm not even assuming that it's compensatory yet, that one away is compensating for another. But that came in the problem of defining differentiation, but I'm gonna leave that out. The point being that this is different than just thinking at the conceptual level. This is finding terms that kind of get there to describe what's in theory, but well enough to track data and test, and then to see. And that this required, I think, achieving a level of, it requires, because I don't think I've gotten there, but it requires clarifying what's already in theory explicitly. And when you've got that, you've automatically got a triangle. So this is just the data model. I mean, the goal is the predictive model. And that is a whole separate bag of snakes. There is a hypothetical, I worked with a couple of data scientists on this, computer scientists that are, in their mid-20s and super sharp and motivated, on even just coming up with something that would plausibly work for a predictive model for this kind of data. And I understand it. I don't think I could implement it. I need their help, but it does rely on Markovian probabilities that predicts what the next move would be given the previous series of moves, the time series. It's kind of complicated, but the point being that that would have to be a computer program that would read in these sequences captured over many, many, many vignettes of emotional process. All right, this is the last piece, and then I'm going to stop. So this is just what that particular model looks like. This is a data model. Some of you have seen this before. This is not the predictive model. This is the data model. It just says what is tracked. That you're tracking a series of moves over time. You have a particular definition for what kind of move is happening. You have one person who's making a move. You have one or more recipients of that move, and then you have the change in arousal in response to that move by any one of the people within the scope of the vignette. So, you know, it took a lot of work to get here. I don't know that this is right. I've got 3 vignettes recorded for my family, and honestly, the effort, the hard part in the future is collecting data. And that, I don't know how I'm going to collect data. But, you know, so goes the project. And there's all kinds of problems with this. It's like, well, how do you scope the vignette? How do you know who to include? You know, it's like, well, do you include the whole family? Well, I don't know, but I'm just tracking vignettes that can be tracked. You know, all these questions have to be answered with lots of data. But I do think that this is data. It's closer to data than just notes, because it has a data model that is more objective than something that's just occurs in discussion or on a family diagram. You could totally critique the objectivity of the move thing, and hopefully someday someone will. You could critique whether or not arousal is an accurate representation of anxiety. I don't think it is, but you sacrifice in modeling, and that's part of the deal, and then it gets updated later. But the whole point just being that, back to this chain of command thing, because I think this is the best visualizer, that this modeling phase is a separate conversation that has separate rules, and that the rules, if you will, for defining theory and thinking about theory and implementing theory are pretty darn rich and good under the Bowen theory literary tradition. Maybe that's a good word for it, literary tradition. At least, because then you have something concrete of literary publications. Like, it's really pretty good, but the modeling part isn't there. I don't think Bowen got into this, and I'm not saying he didn't, because I don't know, and I don't know what are in the archives. Maybe he had a data model. I'd love to go see. I've actually got a proposal in to go see, because I think that question needs to be answered. But if I'll just tie it up with this. If his model was not actually implicit, only implicit, it's always going to be somewhat implicit. If there was an explicit data model, if there was an explicit predictive model, even if it was just rules on paper, because that can be explicit too, so long as it doesn't require calculation in the head, you know. Then, and it actually predicted what he said he was predicting, then that would be, I think, the topic of conversation automatically, rather than the story of the NIM study, which is the topic of conversation usually. Whenever I've written about Bowen theory, I've always had to start with the story for people who don't know Bowen theory, because that places it in context. But as far as I know, and I think as far as any mainstream researcher, those models were implicit, because, you know, where are they? And so the next step would be to produce them. So I'm going to stop there. And which one should I leave? Well, I'm just going to take off the screen share. I don't want to leave this up. And I don't know what you all think of that. I am pushing this out as an argument. I think that this is right, but how the heck do I get off screen share? I lost it. I don't have any buttons. Hidden. Okay. Anyway, I don't know if it's right. You never do. But there's a particular function I'm getting at with each one of these. These all came out of real world problems, and it's my attempt to solve a problem. or a series of problems that that I think that I think are natural to happen given a topic of such complexity.